let me give some context to what we're going to talk about today. Because we still have, amazingly so, a 10.2 million jobs deficit in the United States, both to make up the jobs we lost during the Great Recession, that's why it was called great, but also to keep pace with population growth. We don't just need more jobs, we need better jobs, because we went from 81 million people in this country being poor or near poor to 107 million in 1 decade. We've never seen a quantum leap like that. So we're not going to need to restructure our economy from one that's inward focused to one that's outward oriented. And I'm going to make 3 points today. The first point is we need a different growth model. We need to move towards a next economy that is driven by exports, powered by low carbon, fueled by innovation, and therefore rich with opportunity, so we can bring down the numbers of poor and near poor. We need to understand that this economy will be largely led by cities and metropolitan areas, because our country, really like all the major economies in the world, is a network of metropolitan economies. There really is no American economy or Chinese economy or Brazilian economy. What we are a network of city and metro economies. And finally, at a time where Washington is challenged, right? That's a nice euphemism. Cities and metropolitan areas are going to have to drive innovation in policy, in practice, and in economy shaping, off, obviously, the platform of policies and investments we have at the national level. So let me walk through each one of these, and let me start with the vision thing. Now let's start with exports, because I think our vision is more firms trading with more countries and cities relating to the world, and here's why. We have crossed the economic Rubicon. The big countries, Brazil, India, and China, are now a larger share of global GDP than the United States, and they will grow, and we will shrink as a share of global GDP. Why are they rising? They're rising because they're urbanizing and they're industrializing. Half the world now lives in cities, and that share will grow to about 60% by 2030. The locus of economic power in the world has shifted. The highest performing cities and metropolitan areas among the top 300 are now all essentially in Asia, with Europe and portions of the United States lagging. Atlanta, 153rd out of 300. We're still coming out of this recession. And we underperform on exports. We're a very large country. We've looked internally for our growth. Only 13% of our GDP is dedicated to exports compared to these much larger shares in other parts of the world. You go to portions of the United States, our transportation networks are clogged and congested because we have deferred investment in our infrastructure. And we all know Americans don't get out much, right? We may be the most diverse country in the world. At times, we seem like the most insular because we have such a large domestic market. So here's the question really for the country. Can we get back in the export game? And our answer is decidedly yes. And it's decidedly yes because we still make things in this country. Advanced aerospace, advanced space, advanced automotive, high-precision surgical instruments, high-quality pharmaceuticals, high-value goods. That's what we make. We're ranked third largest exporter of manufactured goods in the world, behind China, of course, and behind Germany, because Germany has focused on being a production economy while we focused on being a consumption economy. And the good news, and particularly for a metro like Atlanta, is we have a trade surplus in services, business services, professional services, tourism, students coming to Georgia Tech and Georgia State and Emory, right? So we have a great platform to build on with regard to exports. Low carbon. Low carbon is a political issue at times in the United States. In the world, it's just a market necessity because the infrastructure we build, the communities we develop, the energy we use is shifting all around the world. And in China and in Germany and Brazil, they understand that this is the next industrial revolution, and whichever country can basically be at the vanguard of it are going to be supplying the products and services to those rising cities that I just talked about. So can we play? Even though we have tended to polarize this conversation, we have 2.7 million clean economy jobs in the United States across 5 super sectors and 39 subsectors. And just to put that into context, that is bigger than biosciences, bigger than fossil fuels, and about 60% of IT. And here's the most important thing. This is an export part of our economy. You'll hear from Sunniva later, obviously a company that came out of the Georgia Tech incubator with a focus globally, right? So building a clean economy is about building an export economy, and it's more export intense than the economy as a whole. Third part is innovation. Now, innovation obviously fuels the growth of economy. What we're relearning in the United States post-recession is the interplay of production and innovation. Manufacturing sector, 9% of the jobs, 11% of the GDP in the United States, 35% of the engineers, 68% of private sector R&D, and 90% of the patents. And so we need to remember to make things again, because any country that basically decides it's going to be a post-industrial economy is going to stop innovating and stop growing. So can we be that innovation nation? Well, here's what's happening. Wages are going up in China. We're having a shale gas revolution in the United States. So we can begin to manufacture things again. Last piece is opportunity. We need to understand that exporting makes firms more competitive globally, and therefore they pay workers better wages with better benefits. So if we're going to lower that number of 107 million Americans who are poor and near poor, we're going to have to grow in some different ways. And we're going to have to get real smart real fast. About 25% of our workforce today is African American and Hispanic. It'll be 40% in the not so distant future. Here's the challenge. We have huge racial and ethnic disparities on education and skills. We have always tended to think about this as a fairness issue in the United States. Mark my words, it is a competitiveness issue for our country. We've got to upgrade the skills and education of our rising workers. So that's a macro picture, right, of our very robust economy, but let's take it down to scale. This is the true American economy. 100 metros, Atlanta obviously a leading one of them. After decades of growth, they sit on 12% of our land mass, they're 2/3 of our population, they're 3/4 of our GDP. All metros together are 84% of our population and more than 90% of our GDP. We are a metropolitan nation. We may not act like one all the time, but we are. 47 of the 50 states have a majority of their GDP generated by their metro areas, including such rural states as Nebraska and Iowa and Kansas and Arkansas. We haven't been a rural country since the 1920s. Georgia, top 3 metros, Atlanta, Augusta, reaching up into Chattanooga, 66% of the GDP. All metros in this state, 82% of the population, 87% of the GDP. Right? Georgia is a metropolitan state. That's why you're such a prosperous state. Top 100 metros on exports, 66% of the population, obviously leading on service exports. Getting close on manufacturing. A lot of our second-tier metros tend to be our major manufacturing metros. When you think about other statistics, particularly on the front lines of trade with China, India, and Brazil, chemical products, business and professional services, computer and electronic products, basically coming out of our top 100 metros. On trade logistics, well, what are cities and metros? They are logistics hubs, right? So a large portion of the trade, not all of it's moving through Hartsfield, but a good amount, right? But the top 100 are excelling at trade logistics. And then, of course, on some other critical statistics, on human capital in particular, the top 100 metros are excelling. Here's the post-recession paradigm shift that we have to have. Pre-recession, we were obsessed with consumption, right? Atlanta, Austin, Denver, Detroit. A Walmart is a Walmart is a Walmart, right? Same footprint, same prices, same design. That's why they're so successful. You go out to a suburban subdivision, pretty much looks the same outside of Atlanta as it would look outside of Phoenix. But what Atlanta is good at is really quite different at what Austin is good at, or Detroit or Denver. We're beginning to relearn the power of distinction and differentiation in the global economy. You're obviously a logistics hub, multinational corporations, Georgia Tech, world-class universities, Georgia State, and the legacy of the Olympics. But that's just the surface of what this metropolis has to offer the world. We do dashboards on every single metro. You have about 142,000 manufacturing jobs, less manufacturing intense than the country as a whole, but you're seeing some faster growth rates. Export volume, $20 billion a year. Less export intense than the country as a whole, but that's because a large portion of your exports are coming from services, not from manufacturing. So it's the manufacturing metros that are going to be more export intense because of the value of those goods. But here you're seeing your top export sectors today, which is obviously the platform from which to build. Now, in terms of your export destinations, not surprising to anyone in this room, right? You start with Canada and Mexico, and then you begin to work your way down through the mature economies and some of the rising economies like China and Brazil. Now, Hartsfield, enormous connectivity to the world, right? I mean, most metropolitan areas would kill to be at the hub of the global economy as you are today. And you can see here, where are people starting in Atlanta going to, and where are people coming from? Interestingly enough, the connections to Korea just jump off the chart, right, for a whole bunch of reasons that I'm sure people in this room understand. But it is critical to use this evidence and use this data to demystify what is the shape and structure of your economy so you can begin, as we talk about solutions, to build and to leverage. Immigrant profile, let's put it this way. The United States is demographically blessed, right? Because we are in a competitive world where many of our competitors, particularly in Europe, and frankly even in China, are hitting a demographic wall. But we have immigrants. We are still an open society, both for low-skilled, middle-skilled, and high-skilled, and we see the benefit that this provides, both in terms of firm startups, talent attraction, talent retention, and expansion. So how do you build from that envious base, right? I mean, what's the purposeful and deliberate way that you can up your game? Well, we live in a country where we're not waiting for the regs anymore, right? Cities and metros are powerful here. Power is diffuse. So what we've been doing at Brookings in collaboration with the Obama administration is to help cities and metros create deliberate export strategies. It starts obviously with an economic profile, right? Because we want to make this evidence-based. You just can't say, oh, I wish I was like, and then put in your favorite city. You are what you are. Goals and strategies, right? You can start with doubling exports, is what the president sort of announced in a State of Union a couple of years ago. But then the key question is, how do you get there, particularly by helping those middle market firms and small and medium-sized enterprises that really do need to help? And then finally, how do you collaborate to compete? How does a city mayor work closely with suburban county leaders? How do you work together, public, private, civic, university, labor, right? So that you basically can all get on the same page. Now, in Portland, you know, people think of Portland as weird and crunchy, right? Portlandia, if you've watched that show, right? Guess what? Tektronix went there in 1946. Intel followed in 1975. This is one of 5 metropolitan areas that doubled their exports between 2003 and 2008 off their computer and electronics base. And as they began to go through their numbers, they basically said, we've obviously got to build off that incredible base, but what we also need to do is take our brand as sustainability. Someone said sustainability is to Portland like oil is to Saudi Arabia, right? take that brand and begin to export products and services to the world. So a very robust network of public, corporate, and civic leaders, right, working together off their existing base of computer and electronics, and then moving to the next round, sustainable products and services, doing quite well in the aftermath. LA, radically different kind of economy, right, which was hit really hard back in the early 90s by defense conversion. It goes way beyond, obviously, television and creative media. They've created an LA Regional Export Council, so they actually came in and said, we need a new institution, a new intermediary to pull everything together. But again, same level of collaborate to compete, multi-dimensional, multi-sectoral, multi-jurisdictional. It's hard to know what party anyone is in most of these cities and metros, right? Everyone is basically committed to place more than to party. The U.S. Conference of Mayors basically said, after we've did about 3 or 4 of these, why don't we have 25 cities and metros stand up in the next 2 years so that we can really have a bubbling effect, right? A revolutionary effect, bottom up. And Atlanta's one of those 25. Now, what's your export plan going to look like? I don't know. And frankly, anyone who got up here and told you without looking at the evidence would be violating the whole process, right? Which is to try to work together across multiple lines to develop something where there's a unified narrative. So if the Metro Chamber goes abroad, or the mayor goes abroad, or the head of Georgia Tech goes abroad, right? You're all talking from the same point. That is effective, right? Once you have that kind of vision and narrative. And we will work with you on that. Now, we still live in a union of states, and states are really critical, right? So who's best in class? Florida, obviously, particularly out of Miami, has tried to be the gateway to Latin America. Enormous amount of export assistance and a focus on multimodal approaches to freight logistics, huge public-private investments, particularly in the southern portion of the state. Colorado, we've just finished working with the governor, the mayor, and the business community on focusing on the advanced space cluster, which is a burgeoning cluster clustered around the Denver airport, the old military airports, and off of their research base. Ohio basically made a bet, $700 million on the so-called third frontier public sector capital for tech-oriented, engineering-oriented firms because they felt they needed to retool their industrial economy. I'm going back about 10 years ago. And then Georgia. I mean, Georgia does start with some international presence, very good at foreign direct investment. The southern states, frankly, have always been very good at FDI and very committed, the governor level on down, to basically upgrading and deepening the Port of Savannah, which is your outlet for many of your goods and services, and obviously for the imports. And this Georgia competitiveness report that the governor put out, it's exactly the kind of forward-looking thinking that we need as we move out of this post-recessionary period. The federal government, they do matter, right? I mean, it would be nice to have a functioning national government, since most of our competitors have one. But, you know, we're Americans, so, you know, we'll do without it if we have to. So, but if we did have a functioning federal government, what would we want them to do? Open new markets. We need more free trade agreements, particularly with Europe and the Pacific. Reform immigration. We have to be the #1 magnet for international talent in the world. Have to be. This is not a political debate. It's an economic imperative. We got to modernize and prioritize our trade corridors. There is no national freight strategy in the United States. There probably won't be one, and that's why you've got to basically take responsibility for airport modernization in Savannah. Exim Bank, fundamental. It is fundamental to have this kind of public commitment to export financing because all of our competitors give their firms these kind of resources. And finally, international market intelligence. When you go abroad and you go to our consulates, we want our people on the ground to be best in class, understanding market research, understanding the regulatory hurdles, helping firms basically do their business. And finally, networking globally. This is really where the world is about to go. If you look across the world today, what you see are networks of trading cities that have similar clusters, obviously multinational corporations with offices throughout. So you see the financial capitals of the world, starting with New York, beginning to relate to their sister cities, true sister cities. You see the manufacturing capitals of the world relating very, very closely through supply chains. Not so much just competition, but collaboration at the global scale. And then you see these major, major logistic hubs beginning to engage with each other in very structured way. Now, some will say, this is a new thing, right? Well, actually, this is the way the world initially evolved. This is the part where I get to use my history degree, which obviously doesn't usually get used. But this is the Silk Road, right? Go back 2,000 years. Before nation states, before nations, there were cities, and cities traded with each other. The Romans traded what they were good at, right? The Chinese traded what they were good at. The Indians traded what they were good at. Each city had a distinctive purpose. It had a distinctive set of goods and services that it provided, and it began to engage in very collaborative ways. This is now the 21st century. To build on what Mayor Reed said and what you'll hear really from Mayor Daley, this is an urban age. It is a metropolitan century. Cities and metros are the centers of their national economies. They are the centers of their trade and investment. They're on the vanguard of all the major issues in the world. As this century evolves, we are going to see this network of cities engaging with each other. And there would be nothing that would be better, frankly, for the city of Atlanta and metropolitan Atlanta to be right smack at the hub of that new network. Thank you very much. And I now have the honor to introduce Amy Liu, who is the co-director of the Brookings Metropolitan Program, who will take us through a panel that she will introduce. Thank you.